All right, part two of the semester. So far, we've been looking mainly at the consumer side of the economy. We've had supply curves, and we've taken for granted that the supply side is going to supply things, different quantities at different prices. But when it comes to any detail in which we've probed into the economy, we've looked mainly at the consumer side, optimized consumer consumption plans where marginal utility is equated per dollar spent across all goods and services and blah, 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 blah. We've pretty much taken the supply side for granted, which policymakers do at their own peril. You need a supply side of the economy. It's very easy to fall in the trap of thinking that producers are going to produce essentially an infinite amount of stuff, and they're going to sell it at whatever price they feel like selling it at, and they're going to make infinity dollars as a result, and they're always going to be there as long as there's some demand. And it's obviously, if you really think about it, and we all know that that's not really the way it works. So for the rest of the semester, we're going to be focusing on the producer side of the economy and how producers make decisions. Now that makes it sound like it's really involved, it's really detailed for any one firm. But actually what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a lot of different types of markets and how firms are going to behave in different ways given the different incentives they face. Remember, economics is all about incentives and people following them. That's one of the assumptions we make. People will follow incentives to their best possible end. So the producer side of the economy. A few assumptions we're going to make. Again, we're assuming that all producers want to maximize profits, and if producers are going to maximize profits, they are necessarily going to minimize their costs. So they want to keep their costs as low as possible while producing as much as they can sell at the highest price they can charge. They want their revenues to be higher than their costs so they can make as much profit as possible, and that's what rational people do. Any producers who do anything different, they're not going to change it by that large of a degree, so it is a useful way to model them. Now, before we get into the different markets, we're going to start off by focusing on some things that are some terminology that's going to come up in every market and some features really of every market. And we're going to start with the difference between explicit costs and implicit costs so that we can have a difference between economic versus accounting profit. When we talk about profit, we're oftentimes going to simplify and say that accounting and economic profit are equal, but there are also going to be contexts in which we're going to want to keep in mind the difference between the two so we can wrap our heads around, for instance, the way perfect competition works. What am I talking about? Well, we'll get to all of that stuff. But first, explicit costs. This is pretty straightforward. Monetary payments made by individuals, firms, governments for the use of resources. You put money out there, that's an explicit cost. You measure, hey, it cost me $20 to buy this one thing that I'm using to make the widgets. $20, that's your explicit cost. That's your cost. Pretty easy so far. So why do we have to put the explicit in front of it? Well, that's to distinguish it from, from implicit costs. But to understand implicit costs, we revisit opportunity costs real quick. Remember, opportunity costs, the next best alternative is what it's all about. Recall that this is used by economists because we don't always have money with which we can measure things like explicit costs. Whatever value you get from hanging out with friends instead of going to work, you can't always put a dollar amount on that. So whatever you lost by going to work instead, that's your opportunity cost. It's for things where we don't always have money that we can use to assess the value of things. But it's also useful when we do have money, as we're going to see when we look at the distinction between economic and accounting profit. Opportunity costs are something that if you're going to look at things from an economic standpoint, where you're going to look at resources that have, remember, the alternative use is part of the definition of economics. You can use a resource for one thing, you can use it for another thing. You can't use it for both. Well, whatever decision you make, you have to factor in the lost opportunity for whatever else you could have used that resource for, to get the total picture of what your costs are, to get a complete sense of how to economize. And that's how we understand implicit costs. Implicit costs don't just take the money part of explicit costs. Implicit costs take the money part as well as, implicit costs take the opportunity costs. Implicit costs are basically the things that are a little bit more difficult to slap a dollar sign on. You don't have a bill that you sent to somebody, an account receivable or something like that, with a specific dollar amount, easy to measure. You don't have something like that. Instead, you have the time and effort you put into running your business. It's hard to put a monetary value on that. Sometimes we can estimate it, but that's a more difficult thing to factor in. But it is an implicit cost you have to think about that is going to go above and beyond whatever checks you have to write to operate whatever business you're operating on. So, profit. We think we know what this is, and we're usually right. But I just alluded to the fact that there's a difference between economic and accounting profit. So what are those differences? Well, accounting profit, when we talk about a profit equation, this is actually what we're usually talking about. TR stands for total revenue. We talked about this when we covered elasticity. Total revenue is price times quantity. Take the quantity that you sold and the price at which you sold them, multiply them together, and you have your total revenue. Your explicit costs, again, this is the money that you're putting out there. This is the simplest way to understand profit. It costs you this much to run your business. This is the amount that you brought in. Subtract the two, and that's your profit. And we'll often refer to this as just profit. Profit is your revenues minus your costs. And this can be a negative number, right? Businesses run on losses. We know this. Your revenues are low, your costs are high, your profits are negative. Maybe you can stay open for a while, but can't do it forever. We're actually going to get to the shutdown decision too as part of talking about costs and how firms work. But getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. This can be a negative number, but this is as simple as it gets, and we're oftentimes going to assume that this is the only kind of profit we're working with, or we're going to assume that it's explicit and implicit costs, but it's going to be an equation similar to this. But at the end of the day, we're never truly talking about this in an economics class. An accountant working for a business is going to come up with this when calculating profit, and they're not necessarily wrong. However, if we're looking at things from a more academic, less pragmatic economic standpoint, and we want to know about our scarce resources that have alternative uses and get a full picture on how efficient we're being, we need to look at economic profit, which looks like the same thing, but instead of explicit costs, we have economic costs. An economic cost is going to be all of your opportunity costs, your implicit costs, as well as your explicit costs. It's every kind of cost, both the money that you're putting out there, but also the alternative things you could have done with your time, with any other tool or resource that you use to make your goods and services. So we have a different number here. And one thing to note is that this number is always going to be less than accounting profit. Economic profit is always less than accounting profit because everything in the accounting profit equation is here in the economic profit equation. But the economic profit equation has some extra stuff on this side of the minus sign. You're subtracting out all of the total revenues are the same. These explicit costs are here. And then you're going to subtract out even more stuff, your implicit costs, your opportunity costs. So economic profit is always less than accounting profit. And we use this to take into consideration all the alternatives you could have done with your time, with the space you use, with maybe a car that you use for your business, whatever. The other things you could have done with it, you can't do those anymore. Those are costs you have to factor in to decide whether you're making the best use, doing the best economizing with your resources, whether you're making an accounting profit or not. And this is going to be an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about perfect competition. Just to move forward a little bit, in perfect competition, there's zero profit. So why is a business going to operate with zero profit? Well, when we say that, what we mean is economic profit is zero, but accounting profit is still positive. You make a $50,000 a year income from your business, you might just be willing to stay in business, but that can be zero economic profit. In perfect competition, if it's truly perfect competition, it is. When we talk about perfect competition, all of that will become a little bit more clear, but this is the economist's way of understanding if we're being efficient. This is the accountant's way of making sure that the money that's coming in and going out, keeping track of all of it and seeing if you're making a profit or a loss. So two different equations to do two different things, similar though these equations may be. And this is another way of writing it, this is the expanded form that has your explicit and implicit costs to show that it's the same equation as this up here, but with more stuff being subtracted out. So as an example of this, let's say your total revenues are $15,000 and your explicit costs are $12,000. You go back here, 15,000 minus 12,000, you've got some positive accounting profit here. Congratulations. You're running your business well. You got positive accounting profit. Oh, but wait. When an economist swoops in and sees implicit costs of 4,000, this is not the explicit money that you're putting out here, and your accountant isn't going to pick this up, but you might think, I'm using my own personal car a lot for this business, and if I didn't run this business but had some other job, I wouldn't use my car as in the same way. It's costing me an extra $4,000 just from the gas from the car or whatever. The more usual example is if you could get a different job instead of running your business, how much would you make? If it was, let's say this is a monthly thing, I can make $4,000 a month doing another job, or I can run this business and make $3,000 a month. Well, we see that our accounting profit might be $3,000 a month, but our economic profit is a loss. So if we're using this as foregone wages, once again, your total revenues, whatever you're making, you're selling it at a price that's bringing in $15,000 per month, but it's costing you in resources and any labor you have to hire, it's costing you $12,000 to get all the product out there that's bringing in $15,000. Your accountant says you make $3,000 a month, not bad. You're making a living. But an economist comes in and says, you were making $4,000 a month at your last job, and they're eager to hire you back. You're losing $1,000 a month as long as you remain in business. You are making an economic loss, even if you have a positive accounting profit. So again, economic profit is always less than accounting profit. And short run we'll talk about in the next video, but again, I'm trying to keep these all below 15 minutes. So you can take a break, or if you want to plow through, you just start up the next one. Either way, whenever you watch it, I'll quote unquote see you